Okay, I'll start with my great-grandparents. My grandfather, great-grandfather, and my great-uncle came to Winnebago County in 1838. And they walked from Chicago to Rockford in 2 days and settled up along the Pecatonica River in Harrison. And when they came to Rockford, they didn't want to live in Rockford because it was too congested. It had 7 homes. Yeah, my father, his parents were from Sweden. They both came to the United States when they were teenagers. And my grandfather on my father's side of the family ran a furniture store in the 200 block of East State Street. My father tells that the Rock River was crystal clear when he was a young person. And he said often you would see somebody catch a carp in the river that when they hung it over the shoulder, its tail would drag on the ground. I don't know if that's a fish story or not, but my father got a job in a bank, and he was there for quite a few years, worked up to the head teller position. And then in 1932, when the Big Depression hit, the bank went bust. He lost his job, all his savings, and they lost their home, and from that point on we were poor most of the time. My senior year in school I had 1 pair of pants and 2 shirts. I got a hole in my pants in chemistry class from acid, and I wore that the rest of the year. When I made National Honor Society, my father went out to a friendly loan company and borrowed money so I could have a suit for the ceremony. And in order for me to go to school, we moved out to Loves Park. So I wasn't learning anything. It wasn't worthwhile. So I told my father and mother that I wasn't going to go to school anymore till I could go to a good school. I was going to get a job. So my father went out and went to East High School, and they allowed me to come to East High School if I paid tuition of $240 a year. Now this was in 1940 something, and my father made $7 a week working in a factory. So he went and borrowed the money from a loan company, a friendly loan company, and I went to East High School for 3 years. It's the longest time I went to any school, anywhere. And because I knew the sacrifices he was making, I applied myself and graduated 12th in a class of 380 students, 1950. Okay, there are several things contributed to it. One time, my father, we lived at South 1st Street, right next to the National Lock Plant, near the National Lock Plant, and one Sunday he and I walked to Black Hawk Park to see the birds that were in the pond that was right by the cliffs there. But we went down to the river, and the river was low. That it was obviously a dry period, and someone had caught a crayfish and put it in a little shallow pond that wasn't in the main channel, and my father picked it up and showed it to me. That was one of my first interests. Another thing that got me interested was that in the summertime I used to go and my sister and I would spend 1 or 2 weeks with my aunt and uncle on a farm down near Rochelle that they leased. And my uncle once gave me I don't remember whether it was a rough green snake or a smooth green snake. It's the only one I ever saw in my life. and I kept it as a pet, but I didn't know how to feed him, so it eventually died. But that helped. And then when I lived in Roscoe, um, my teacher, when I was in the first or second grade, and there were 2 or 3 of us in that grade, went to Florida and she collected some shells and she brought shells back and showed it to him. And my father motor pooled to work with another person, and we had to walk down a lane about half a mile to get to the main road going 51, which at that time went right through the center of Roscoe. And he would occasionally find a snake and bring it and show it to me. And I think that's what got me interested in it. Plus, we usually lived where we didn't have any neighbors, so it was just my sister and I, and we would often in the morning leave early in the morning and come home after dark. And we wouldn't take any food with us or anything like that. We'd just go and wander around through the woods and along creeks and stuff. And we moved and we lived in a house along the river, the Rock River. And so my sister and I would hike along the Rock River and along the creeks and stuff. We called the North Creek Quicksand Creek, because often if you walked on the sand when it was dry or almost dry, the water would pond up through it and your feet would start to sink in. I remember there was a bur oak tree there with a grapevine growing on it. It had 3 trunks. Each trunk on that grapevine was almost 7 inches in diameter. It had been growing on that tree for hundreds of years. Wow. But I got interested in nature because that's what I did. You know, we wandered around. For instance, I remember the date because it's the only one that's been definitely seen in Winnebago County. My sister and I left Roscoe, started hiking along the river, the Rock River, from our house to Hononegah Forest Preserve, which as the crow flies is about a mile, but as the river goes it's 2.5 miles. And we came to a place, there was an old camp, we didn't know what it was, I later found out it was an old scout camp, and I almost stepped on a rough grouse, and it took off right out from under my feet, you know, and I can still see it today, the band on the end of its tail. The rough grouse is, one was reported at one of the forest preserves along the Kishwaukee River by John Bergstrom, who had a PhD in ornithology. People did report one calling at the banding station one time when we were out there banding. Linda heard it.
And yeah, and bobwhite, were they around?
They used to be. They used to be very common. There were 3 coveys of bobwhites by the banding station. And the coveys roost in a clump at night facing out. So if something comes, they all fly off in different directions and confuse the thing. And there were 3 coveys there, and at dawn they give a morning call, not the bobwhite call, but another call. And every time I was out there early in the morning, I'd hear those 3 coveys calling to each other, but they're gone from Winnebago County now. Well, my main interest to begin with was aquatic creatures. I would wade up and down creeks. Occasionally, my sister and I would go to the North Connecticut Creek, if that's what the name is. When during the dry periods, we dam it up, and that would dry the thing up, and then you could catch all kinds of little fish and stuff like that. And I kept trying to catch turtles, and the first turtle I saw stick his head up was right near the shore, so I reached down and picked it up, and I had it in my hand, and it started scratching my hand, and I dropped it. And I didn't catch another one for over a year, but I got to the point where I was very proficient at catching turtles, so I kept turtles as pets and fed them. I did that for years and years. I started birdwatching in January 1st, 1943. And my sister got interested in birds, and I was not that interested in birds. I preferred to catch frogs and turtles and snakes if I could find them, which I wasn't very proficient at that time. And when winter came, and I've got the book that got her interested in this thing here. I managed to find one in a used bookstore. It was Birdcraft by Mabel Osgood Wright. She got interested and she wanted me to go birdwatching with her, but I wouldn't do it because I was busy doing fun things like catching crayfish and frogs and stuff like that. But when winter came, I consented to go with her and I got interested. And eventually she talked me into starting a year list, and we both started our year list at that time, January 1st, 1943. And a life list. She eventually became the bird expert for New Mexico and Arizona, and was the editor for New Mexico and Arizona for 10 years for American Birds, which was the journal that listed all the rare birds and analyzed what happened to the bird populations. And anybody that published a book on birds of New Mexico cleared it with her and made sure it was accurate before they published it. By 1964, I'd been in all 50 lower states looking for birds. Since then, I've been in all the states, including Alaska. I've been to Attu Island, Alaska, which is further. Attu is further from Anchorage than Seattle is from Miami. I was in the 10th grade, and Leland Ellis went out birdwatching. Leland Ellis was one of my birdwatching friends. This was in 1948. I remember driving down the road and we saw a lark sparrow, which is a western sparrow that usually didn't occur here. And that was exciting. And then we parked up by the bridge, and this was the old bridge. That when it was an old iron bridge that was north, it was replaced in 1953, and they straightened the road out at that time. And we hiked back in, and it was in May, and there were lots of birds around, lots of good birds. But all of a sudden, both of the other two started going ooh and ah, and they were looking at plants instead of birds, which I knew the forest plants, but I didn't know the prairie plants. And I realized that it must be an unusual area. And I remember we drove around across the bridge and around the curve, and I don't know if that's the same trip or another one, but we found ladies' tresses. It was had apparently been a summer escape place for someone. There was a cabin up on the hill that was not as big as this room, sitting on a cement foundation. And around the cabin was one of the finest prairies you'd ever seen, sand prairies. It had never been plowed. Part of what I eventually owned was grazed. The first part that the Forest Preserve bought where I banded birds. And one time I was hiking around there and I met a woman there, and she said her grandfather had owned the property and had a herd of 1,500 sheep on the property, and 700 of them starved to death. So you can imagine how closely grazed that piece of property was. Well, Colored Sands was a place we went birding often. And there were four of us that went together. Dave Seal, who's still alive, and we went bird watching every weekend together. And we went there one time and stopped at the quarry next to where they used to collect the colored sand and started turning stones over and found snakes. And then we found blue-spotted salamanders and the F stage of newts. They're smaller, they have a lot of bright red on them. By the way, the central newt was very common in the ditches on the other side of the river. On the west side of the river, you could take a seine and drag it through the river and get dozens of them. Years later, when I was the director of Burpee Museum, I had live reptile exhibits there because that brought in diverse communities. And I went to the river with my assistant at that time with a seine and seined up and down almost a whole ditch and did not find one central newt. The blue-spotted salamander was more common then than it is now. It's still there. In fact, the spring before last, we caught one of the biggest ones we'd ever seen. It was this long. So there are some there, and of course the blue-spotted salamander is also in a lot of the virgin forests in the Peck River bottoms between Trask Ridge and Peck. I saw an ad in the paper, and that ad in the paper described a piece of property that was for sale that I was sure was the piece of ground that the salamanders was on. And I thought if they build a house there and destroy those quarries, the creatures won't have a place to hibernate. So I went to look at it, and it turned out to be the property next to it, the house that's on the hill up there. So I thought, well, I'd like to see it preserved, so I went to the county tax office here in Winnebago County and got the name of the person that paid the tax, and it was Olson, and he lived in Durand. So I wrote a letter to that person and said I was interested in buying it, and I got a call from a woman, and she said, "Are you interested in buying that?" And I said, "Yes, I am." "How much will you pay?" Well, I told her what the other properties around there had sold for, and she says, "Well, you're not interested," and hung up without telling me who she was, where she was, or anything. But I could hear factory noises in the background. And at that time, the only jobs that women had in factories were timekeepers and working in tool cribs. So I worked at the telephone company calling on factories, and so did 3 or 4 of the other salespersons. So I asked them to keep their eyes open for somebody that lived in Durand that worked in a factory in town. And one of my fellow salesmen called on National Lock, and he lived in Durand, and he motor pooled for a number of years to Rockford to work with this gal that worked there, whose name was Olson. So I found out what her name was now and called her. She didn't know how do you find out who I was? And it took me 1.5 to 2 years to convince her to sell it to me for 3 times what I sold it to the Forest Preserve for 20 years later.
Why is it called colored sands?
Why do they call it colored sand? Well, north of the Wisconsin border there's a lot of St. Peter's sandstone that's on the surface. If you go to up to the towns up there, a lot of the places you'll see big bluffs, and they're all St. Peter's sandstone. That St. Peter's sandstone was washed downstream by the Sugar River, and it was washed downstream to a glacial lake about 10,000 years ago that stretched from Rockton beyond Freeport. So if you go on Meridian Road, when you come down the hill before you get to the river, that flat area is the old lake bed. From time to time, the lake would dry up, and that sandstone that was washed down there, the prevailing winds blowing east would created sand dunes which stretched all the way from the Sugar River to the edge of Rockton. So that St. Peter sandstone also appears on the surface in Colored Sands Forest Preserve and in the Sugar River Forest Preserve. Now, when I bought the property, I saved it from becoming a sandstone quarry, because the day after I bought it, I went out there and there were two guys up on the bluff. They were having a fire there, and I told them I just bought it. They asked me if I'd ever had the sandstone analyzed, that it was a high quality sandstone. And it was obvious they were thinking about turning the bluff into a quarry. The first purchase was the Olson property. That was 20 acres approximately. That's the part that became a nature preserve. All of that became a nature preserve. Shortly after that, there was an ad in the paper for a piece of property for sale by Tom Jones, the realtor. And it sounded like the property to the north, so I got in touch with him, and it was 106 acres. I was sitting in a restaurant with the salespeople at a sales meeting, lunch for a sales meeting at the telephone company where I worked, and he came over and said, "I'm willing to talk to you about your offer." So I didn't have enough money to do it. I bought the first piece of property on contract and borrowed the down payment from my parents and was paying on that. So this opportunity presented, and I didn't have any funds at all, but I had borrowed money from the bank from time to time. I had a good credit rating, and I knew the president of the bank very well. So I went and said, I need to borrow so much money to buy this piece of property. And he said, well, I can do a certain amount. So I entered in a contract with Tom Jones saying that I would pay 10% of the down payment in 6 months, another the balance of the down payment in a year.
And that piece of property now, what are the borders of it? What's on that?
It's all the part of the property that's a nature preserve. It's the part of the property that the banding station itself is on, but not all the property that the nets are on.
Talk about what changes have occurred over the last, 60 years, Colored Sands, since when you bought it?
Yeah, Colored Sands, when I bought it, had just been lumbered, the parts that's in nature preserve, so it was very open. It had a lot of open areas of pure sand, nothing. And back in those days, there were several active sand dunes west or east of Colored Sands.
What was there oak there? Is that what they cut?
It's black oak forest primarily on the high ground. Okay. And one time I wanted to find out how old that forest was, and a tornado apparently came through and snapped an oak tree that was this big in diameter off at the ground. So I and a young man I knew got one of these old saws with a handle on either end, and we cut the end off so we could count the rings. And the date that tree sprung up was 1830, about 1835, 1834, somewhere in there. But Colored Sands at that time had a lot of open ground. There was Kenny Connect there. I found Pipsissola there, the letterleaf grape fern, and a number of plants that are not very common. Well, I found spotted coral root
Oh, okay.
in the 80-acre plot. I was clearing out there was a creek that came out of the limestone and then went back in again. This groundwater apparently was flowing through, and it had created a creek, and it was attractive to deer during the dry periods, and at times it would look like when the deer were real common, looked like a hog lot. For about 50 feet around the thing. But up on the bluff I found, let's see, it was a foxglove, not
Not the false foxglove?
foxglove, not fernleaf foxglove.
The one with the yellow flower, that one?
They're both kinds grew at Colored Sand.
Cool.
The fernleaf foxglove is a parasite on oak roots. And I figured that might be decent prairie, so I started cleaning out the brush. There was a lot of various kinds of brush, not the really bad ones, but enough to shade stuff, and to start clearing that out. And one day when I was down on my hands and knees, selecting which things to cut and which things to keep, I found this coral root stalk. I started hiking around and I found over 200 plants, and some of the plants were a quarter mile apart, so Lord only knows how many were out there. I haven't seen any since, because it's an orchid that grows entirely underground when it sets up a flower stalk. At first I didn't know what the plants were, and at first I didn't know much about maintenance of prairies. But I didn't know about maintenance of natural areas, and the forest grew up again. And gradually, it was, when I first bought it, it was, a lot of it was open sand, and the lupin was scattered throughout all of the area that is now so wooded that it can't even grow. But it is continued to get more forested. The other thing was that George Fell's father, Egbert Fell, I was out there once when George was exploring the property, and he had his mother along, and she was in the car, and she told me that she would bring George's father out there and drop him off at Eel Bridge, and then go to Haas Road, which is a little over a mile up, and sometimes it would take him 6 hours to walk that far because he's busy looking at all the plants. In his book, he describes where a lot of the plants from Winnebago County are, and I used that book to locate a good share of them. He described, for instance, that there was shining club moss there. So I kept looking and looking and looking, and finally one day I found it. There were three kinds of club mosses at Colored Sands when I finally had the whole property. Shining club moss, the one that looks like arborvitae leaves, and there was like one clump that's still there that's would fill almost all this part of the house here. And then I found Lycopodium, I think it's clavatum or maculatum, one or the other. It's the one that grows in the north. It grows along the ground, and it looks like it branches out. I found it, and it wasn't described as being in Winnebago County in any of the books.
Cool.
So I told Marlon Bowes about it, and then all of a sudden he remembered seeing it in a forest preserve in the Cook County.
Wow.
After I told him about it. The things that I've seen happen through the years is, first of all, when I was born, a good share of the natural landscape was destroyed or being destroyed, because I was born in 31. But there were still signs of natural stuff. You would drive along a road and you could find, for instance, if you went down Meridian Road and you came to that level area below, there were places where there were Turk's cap lilies still growing along the edge of the road. They aren't there now. You'd see purple coneflowers along the road, lots of places, pale purple coneflowers. You still can see some places, but they're not a lot of places. So there was still a lot of the natural landscape left. And it was, but you go to those places now and you don't see it, because in order to keep a lot of these plants viable, you have to manage it. And you have to manage it for the plants. So that's one of the differences. The other difference is that Rockford, the footprint of humanity was a lot smaller. There were two vernal ponds that I knew of. One was at High Crest and Alpine. That's where the High Crest shopping center and stuff is. That used to be total wilderness. There wasn't a house out there at all. And that vernal pond had so many frogs in it, in the spring, you could hear them calling as you drove by. South of Rockford, along Sandy Hollow Road, east of Alpine, was a vernal pond that was bigger, had fairy shrimp in it. It's the only place I've ever seen fairy shrimp. And it had tiger salamanders breeding in it, to the extent that if you wanted to catch them and collect them, you could collect 100 of them in a matter of minutes. There were so many tiger salamanders. That eventually that piece of property was bought by a business, and it was filled in with dirt, and now it's piled up full of junk and stuff. It took me a hard time to sell it to him. I had to convince him. I contacted him, told him that it was for sale. They said they weren't interested. So I put an ad in the paper, and I took 2 or 3 people out there, and I had 2 offers for plots to build houses for $2,000 an acre. And one of the people that came out and looked at it was one of the Forest Preserve commissioners. And he went back to the Forest Preserve and told them they should buy it. So I sold it to Forest Preserve for less than half of what I paid for it, and which was, well, I bought part of it for 100 and some an acre, 1974. I sold it to the Forest Preserve with 2 stipulations. Item 1, they should declare the south part a nature preserve, and it became the first nature preserve in the Forest Preserve system. And that people would be allowed to band there as long as there were people interested in doing it. Those were it was never written down, but it was a verbal agreement. I put my first nets up to experiment in 1966. Now, when I bought the property, Dave Seal started banding hawks there before that. So I think it was 65, I think, was when I first bought that part of it. The Forest Preserve decided they were going to have a field trip out to the banding station, the board of directors. And when they got there, the building was so full of people, visitors, they couldn't get in the building.
I remember that building.
Yeah.
What was it? It was just a shack or something.
I had
Or
rental
shack.
property in Beverly Park. And next to it was a non-modern house, no outdoor toilet, no running water, no electricity, with 3 rooms. I found out who the owner was and contacted him and bought the house from him for the value of the lot, essentially, and tore the house down. And Tom Ellis and I then, in between net runs, used the lumber for that house to build the first sizable banding building.
I know
The
Forest
current
Preserve-
building was built when the Forest Preserve owned the property. They tore down the building and they had somebody come out to appraise it. And he said, what is this our structure for? Because he didn't want to call it a shack. During that time, I started seeing natural things disappear, you know, the increase in population, the pond where the frogs sang out there at High Crest became filled in when they built the church out there. And the pond was filled in down on off of Sandy Hollow where the tiger settlements were. And the same thing was true of Love's Park. You know, the Shorewood Park was called Love's Park Woods, and it was a virgin woods. Or maybe not a virgin, I don't, you know, the trees could have been 100 years old. But the marsh was just full of all kinds of wildlife. I saw northern pike swimming in it, stuff like that. It was one of the best bird watching spots in the county was Shorewood Park before they bought it and took the understory out.
So at Colored Sands, have any species appeared there that didn't used to be there?
Yeah, turkey vultures, sandhill cranes. Yeah, there was a badger that lived there for 15 years. I caught a least weasel there. I saw a mink running along the net run once. There were lots of reptiles there. Hognose snakes, blue racers. I caught a blue racer in my yard when I lived there that was 5 feet long. That's huge. So many fox snakes that one time I was in between net runs, I was resting on a blanket on the ground, and I reached back to touch the pillow, and there was a fox snake crawling across the pillow while I was sleeping there. And when I bought the house up there, there was a red-bellied snake under the garage door once, hiding underneath the rubber of the garage door. There were common garter snakes and Midland brown snakes, or decay snakes, whichever name you want to call them. My ancestors, when they settled up by Harrison, claimed that there were rattlesnakes there. But that's a hard claim. There's king snakes too and fox snakes on the property. Both fox snakes and king snakes rattle their tails to imitate rattlesnakes. So most of the reports of all the reports of rattlesnakes in the county are usually fox snakes.
You've talked about the mussel beds there
Yeah,
in the Rock River. You mentioned that at a meeting recently.
yeah. One of the things that the Rock River would dry up from time to time, and there was a big delta for the creek that was exposed when the river was low. When the river was high, it was covered. And I would find some clams there. The creek at Honega Forest Preserve had a similar delta when the river was real low, and it would be full of the kind of mussels that crawl through stones. There's one called the heel splitter that's about this big around. It's real thin. And there's one that it looks like a turkey wing. It would crawls in the stones and stuff, and you would find them there. But this was a sandbar, and it had the sandbar clams there. And Rock River had been a major clamming area for years. In fact, when I lived at Love's Park, one of the places where they apparently brought the clams ashore and dumped them in the hot water to kill them and make them open. And then, so I could go to that when the river was down. I could wade in water ankle deep, over halfway across the river. And it was just full of freshwater clams. Yeah, I would take a gunny sack, and if I could carry it, I could have filled it in a matter of minutes. And that's what happened to most of the streams around here. That the aquatic life is gone. South of north of Baxter. No, south of Baxter Road, Highway 51 crosses Kilbuck Creek. And my father used to take me down there, and there was a rapids immediately above the bridge, was full of rocks. And I could turn over rocks and catch 200 crayfish, one at a time, by hand, in half an hour. I'd bring them home, feed them to my turtles and stuff. I've been to almost when I was up looking at for clams, I looked for crayfish. I didn't see any crayfish. And we would go into town and run errands, and I would go with him. I and my sister would go with him. We saw a sign that said museum. He dropped my sister and I off at the museum. At that time it was on the top 2 floors of the Victorian building. And he dropped us off, and we looked at all the stuff. My sister and I looked at all the stuff on the 2nd floor. Then we went up to the 3rd floor. That's where all the mounted birds were. We were in heaven. They have probably 400 species of mounted birds. And that's when I met Milton. He came up to see what we were doing up there so long, because we'd been up there for hours. And I then visited the museum whenever I had a chance, and I would listen to him to talk to people about nature. I remember him talking to a guy that collected arrowheads that saw the last passenger pigeon in Winnebago County. He was my mentor. He was the director, and for a while the only employee there.
So how did you become director of Burpee Museum years later?
Well, I was, I visited him a lot. I had a live reptile exhibit one summer there when I was 18. And we talked a lot and so forth. So just before I graduated from high school, he said, "Would you be interested in being my assistant?" And of course, I didn't hesitate, because I had written my theme in English about the fact I wanted to become a museum director someday. So I worked there, did all sorts of odd jobs, ran the mimeograph machine, sorted mail, helped Buford clean, helped him judge the art shows by moving the pictures around for him and so forth at the art museum, label fossils, label minerals and things like that, talk to groups. Eventually they asked me to be on the Burpee board, and eventually they elected me to president of the Burpee board. And then Milton was getting into his late 80s and was having trouble doing a lot of things. So they asked him to hire somebody from college to take his place. He said, "Well, I can't hire anybody from college, because in order to be director of a museum, you have to know a lot about nature and lots about various fields of nature." So they asked him who did he know that was like that, and he mentioned me, so they asked me to be director. That's how I became director.
Can you talk about what we've lost, what wildlife we've lost in the last 60 years, and what wildlife has come back?
Yeah, well, the majority of this stuff we've lost. When I lived along the river at Roscoe, if I walked down the path to the river, which was about 100 feet long, there would be land snails crawling across the path. These are snails about so big around. Their eyes are on the end of little stalks and so forth. And if I was choose to pick them up, I could have filled a 5-gallon bucket with the ones just crawling across the path. In the last 40 years, I've seen 6 land snails. One at Neiman Marsh when I had a field trip out there, and the rest of them were at some of the woods in that part of the Peck River bottoms. They're gone. Frogs. When I started banding at Colored Sands, in the spring when the frogs were singing, when you came over the hill and started down the road, you could hear the roar. The roar, it was a roar of spring peepers calling. In 1980, 1990, I think it was, we decided we were going to have a special function for people, and we called it Night Sounds. So I went out to record spring peepers at the same time. All I could hear was about 10 or 12. I'm happy to say that the volume is built up now, but it is gone. The most common frog in the county, the one that was in here by the billions, cricket frog, is extinct in almost all of Illinois. And when I lived in Roscoe and when I used to walk along the streams, one would hop in the stream every foot as I walked along the shore, and they're gone, period. It used to be that if you were driving out on a country road in the summer at night, I can remember driving down Meridian Road with hundreds of frogs, leopard frogs, hopping across the road during a rainstorm. You don't see that anymore. Mm-mm. Snakes. The common garter snake isn't common anymore. One time, Daryl and I decided we'd count and see how many garter snakes we could find coming out of hibernation up in the Sugar River Valley, and we found 275 common garter snakes. Now you're lucky if you see one every once in a while. The trails at the banding station are sandy. When a snake crawls across it, it leaves a track. We don't see snake tracks across the trails anymore. We still see an occasional hognose snake, occasional Midland brown snake. Occasionally we'll see a young fox snake, but they're gone. One of the best examples of something that's decreased are the yellow butterflies, the alfalfa butterfly, roadside butterfly, sulfur butterfly. Yeah. They used to come up out of fields like clouds. I think I've only seen 2 or 3 this year.
What about birds?
Well, birds is a disaster now. When I started banding at Colored Sands, I had 20 nets. I banded between 8,000 and 12,000 birds a year. Now, it got up to the point where we had 100 nets, and when we stopped using 100 nets, we were lucky if we did 6,000 a year. The average year was 4,000. I can remember sitting at a Natural Land Institute on George Fell's back porch, which was right next to Burpee Museum, and his trees being full of warblers that had landed that night, that morning. You don't see trees full of warblers anymore. The only places where you can find trees full of warblers is in places where they fly in along long areas where they can't land, like the ones that fly across the Gulf of Mexico. As soon as they hit shore, they've got to rest because some of them have been flying for 21, 23 hours. So you can go to those places and during the migration season, you can see lots of birds. But elsewhere, no. And anyone that's been birding a long time remarks about that. I can remember when we first lived at Roscoe along the river, I went down there and somebody had caught I think it was a short nose, it was a gar that had a beak this long. Is that short nose or long nose? You don't know. One of them anyway,
Yeah.
they'd caught, and because it was a garbage fish, they'd just thrown it up on the bank and killed it. I doubt if there's any gar left in the Rock River.
What are some examples of bird populations that have dramatically decreased in the last?
Well, basically, warblers, neotropical migrants are the ones that have gone the furthest, or birds with special habitat requirements. I can remember when we used to see a number of Bell's vireos in this county. A Bell's vireo is a western prairie bird. You would find them at Cyril's Prairie. There were a number of them at Rock Cut. Well, now Rock Cut has been taken over by the honeysuckle. The Bell's vireo is gone. They nested along the roadsides in raspberries. If you're a responsible farmer, you don't have any brush in your roadsides. It would be ashamed. You'd probably be kicked out of the thing.
What about bobolinks and grassland birds?
Okay, yeah, the grassland birds are some of the ones that have decreased the most. I will say the Henslow sparrow is, and the clay-colored sparrow, it now nests in the county. I found the first clay-colored sparrows nesting next to the Black Hawk Tree Farm. But the western meadowlark was almost as common as eastern meadowlark. It's gone. The bobolink was almost as common as meadowlarks. It's restricted to a lot of areas. The cerulean warbler. The cerulean warbler used to nest in almost any woods in the county that had mature trees. They even nested in the trees along the river at the banding station. They have disappeared from a good share of the county. Sugar River Forest Preserve always used to have a population of anywhere from 5 to 10 pair. In fact, a fellow that I was on Attu Island out in the Aleutian Islands hadn't seen a cerulean warbler, so I told him to come to Rockford, and I took him out there and showed him the bird in a matter of minutes. There hasn't been any there. And some southern birds are coming further north now. That's a change. The orchard oriole was a rare bird. You're lucky if you saw one. I saw my first orchard oriole in the county after 20 years of birding here. And that's not just going out occasionally, that was every weekend. And now we band at the banding station 10 to 30 a year. It's a southern bird, come north. Well, the bigger birds are increasing in population. Used to be that you were lucky if you saw a bald eagle every 5 years. The bald eagle is now more common in the county than the red-tailed hawk.
Really?
Sandhill cranes. I saw my first sandhill cranes at what is now Nigran in 1960. The first, it was just a pair migrating, 20 birds migrating over. Now there's over 20 pairs nesting in the county. Turkeys weren't in the county when I started birding. So big birds are doing well, small birds aren't doing so well.
So what about otters?
Well, I saw my first otter tracks at Honega Forest Preserve. And that was quite a while ago. Then I saw otter tracks at Colored Sands. It had snowed the night before. And there was this trail where this creature had walked through, and he walked under branches this high and didn't knock snow off of them. And had great big footprints. He walked from way up in the woods on the north side of the road down to the river, and that was, I haven't seen an otter in the county till 3 years ago. my first daughter in the county. Well, I've been told by Dan Williams and Bob Severson that they'd seen otters south of Sugar River Forest Preserve. I saw 3 of them later at Nygren from the platform.
Did you ever see a prairie chicken in this county?
I don't know. When I lived in Loves Park, Forest Hills Road, the hills were all still virgin prairie, or mostly virgin prairie. I mean, 99%. And one time was driving down there, and they'd just finished building the American Chickle plant, and 4 grouse-like birds flew across the road. They may have been prairie chickens, I don't know. Prairie chickens existed in the county until 47 or 48 up at Yale Bridge. Milton told me there were prairie chickens at Yale Bridge, and I got a hold of some old Illinois Audubon bulletins, and they described prairie chickens being it.
Would that have been in that low area west of the Sugar River, or where?
I would think it would be the low area. They might have, because I'm not sure it was open enough for a booming ground on the other side. It might have been south of Yale Bridge Road, because there were hills there where there was prairie willows.
And have you talk about what you see as the future and how humans can, what we can do to make things better?
Well, the thing that probably would have the most effect on a lot of species, but not necessarily the ones that are rare or in trouble, is a person's yard. Lots of brush, lots of grass, lots of thickets, places for insects to live, trees that are insect friendly like oak trees. A domestic maple, like the one that's in the center of the yard that I killed, may have 40 species of insects in it. A bur oak, here comes the goldfinch in for the feeder. A bur oak has 280 species of insects in it. So if you can create habitats for the birds and all sorts of creatures in your yard, and it doesn't matter where your yard is. We had a person give a talk at the Wild Ones, I don't know if you were at that one, that lives near O'Hare on the approach, and she listed all the birds they'd seen in the yard and insects and stuff. I won the Young Artist Contest at Burpee Art Museum with that painting in 1950.
And what kind of owl is that?
It's a short-eared owl. My instructor wanted my paintings to show other students how to do things in ink, and that is the painting he kept when he retired. And there was an article in the paper about me. He called me and met me for lunch and said, I've been showing this to classes for years. And I won an art contest at the Sinisippi Audubon with that photograph of a male goshawk.